This match was played between Nepomniachtchi and Garry Kasparov in GCT Blitz Croatia 2021. This was the third event of the 2021 Grand Chess Tour, a professional chess tournament held in Zagreb, Croatia, from July 7 to 11, 2021. Nepomniachtchi starts with pawn to c4, aiming to control the center and create space for the pieces to develop. Garry Kasparov responds with pawn to b6, preparing to develop the queenside pieces. White develops the knight to c3, supporting the central pawn and preparing to develop other pieces. Black plays pawn to e6, supporting the d5 square and preparing to develop the dark squared bishop. Nepomniachtchi plays pawn to e4, expanding in the center and gaining space. Black develops the bishop to b7, putting pressure on the central pawn. White develops the knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5 and preparing to develop other pieces. Black develops the bishop to b4, pinning the knight and putting pressure on the pawn on c3. Nepomniachtchi develops the bishop to d3, supporting the central pawn. Garry Kasparov exchanges the bishop for the knight, gaining a pawn but also giving up the bishop pair. White recaptures the bishop with the pawn. Black plays pawn to d6, supporting the central pawn and preparing to develop other pieces. White develops the knight to d4, attacking the pawn on e6 and putting pressure on the position. Black develops the knight to d7. White plays pawn to b3, preparing to develop the queenside pieces. Black develops the knight to c5, attacking the bishop and putting pressure on the position. White plays pawn to f3, supporting the central pawn and preparing to develop other pieces. Black exchanges the knight for the bishop, gaining a pawn and opening up the position. White recaptures the knight with the queen, putting pressure on the position. Black develops the knight to e7. Nepomniachtchi develops the bishop to g5, putting pressure on the knight and attacking the pawn on f6. Garry Kasparov develops the queen to d7, supporting the pawn on c6 and putting pressure on the position. White plays pawn to a4, preparing to develop the queenside pieces and attacking the pawn on b6. Black plays pawn to f6, attacking the bishop and gaining space. White retreats the bishop to h4, maintaining pressure on the position. Garry Kasparov is taking his time. Black plays pawn to e5. Nepomniachtchi is thinking a little longer. Nepomniachtchi develops the knight to c2, supporting the pawn on e4 and preparing to develop other pieces. Kasparov plays pawn to g5, attacking the bishop and gaining space. White retreats the bishop to f2, maintaining pressure on the position. Black plays pawn to f5, attacking the pawn on e4 and gaining space. Nepomniachtchi is taking his time. White develops the knight to e3, supporting the pawn on f5 and putting pressure on the position. Black plays pawn to f4, attacking the knight and gaining space. Nepomniachtchi develops the knight to d5, attacking the pawn on c7 and putting pressure on the position. Black exchanges the knight for the knight, opening up the position. White recaptures the knight with the pawn. Black plays pawn to a5. White develops the queen to b5, putting pressure on the pawn on c7 and attacking the bishop. Kasparov is thinking a little longer. Black develops the bishop to a6, attacking the queen and gaining space. Nepomniachtchi is thinking. Nepomniachtchi exchanges the queen for the queen, simplifying the position. Black recaptures the queen with the king, maintaining material equality. White plays pawn to c4, gaining space and putting pressure on the position. Garry Kasparov plays pawn to h5. White plays pawn to h3. Kasparov develops the king to e7. White develops the king to e2. Kasparov is thinking. Black develops the bishop to c8. White develops the rook to g1. Black develops the bishop to d7. White plays pawn to g3. Black develops the rook to g8, putting pressure on the pawn on g3 and preparing to attack. White exchanges the pawn for the pawn, opening up the g-file for the rook. Black recaptures the pawn with the pawn, maintaining material equality. White plays pawn to h4, gaining space and putting pressure on the position. Black develops the king to f7. White develops the king to d2. Black develops the king to e7, supporting the pawn on d6 and preparing to develop other pieces. Nepomniachtchi is thinking. White develops the king to e2. Black develops the king to f7. Ian Nepomniachtchi develops the king to d2. Garry Kasparov develops the king to e7, maintaining the draw. The game ends in a draw. To watch many more such games of all the legendary grandmasters, you may visit the channel and subscribe to it. Don't forget to like and share the video if you like it. Thank you for watching.